Look at her, scrubbing the same stone for the third time. Cursed with bad luck, that one." The words sliced through the air like a blade finding flesh between ribs. Lyra felt them settle into the familiar hollow beneath her breastbone where all the cruelties lived, stacked like kindling, waiting for a spark. She kept her eyes fixed on the grey stone beneath her raw knees, her brush moving in steady circles that had worn grooves into both the floor and her soul. The servant who had spoken laughed, a sound sharp enough to shatter glass. "My grandmother always said some wolves are born broken. Look at her wolf, grey as dishwater and twice as useful." Lyra's wolf pressed closer to her ribs, a wounded thing that had learned to make itself small. She had stopped defending herself years ago. That had always been enough to keep breathing, keep moving, keep invisible. The grand hall of the Moonspire Palace stretched around her like a cathedral built to worship power she would never possess, its soaring arches and crystal chandeliers catching the late afternoon sun and throwing it back in patterns of light that never touched her corner of shadow. The harvest moon ceremony preparations buzzed around her with the energy of a hive disturbed. Tomorrow night, unmated wolves would gather in the sacred grove, and the ancient magic would guide them to their destined partners. The ceremony happened once every 3 years, and this year carried special significance. Everyone whispered about it, the way they whispered about sacred things and dangerous things and things that changed the world. Lyra touched the tarnished silver chain at her throat, hidden beneath the rough brown fabric of her servant's dress. The pendant that hung from it was no bigger than her thumb, its surface worn smooth by decades of nervous fingers. Her grandmother had pressed it into her palm on her deathbed 7 years ago, her eyes bright with fever and something that might have been fear. "Keep it safe," the old woman had whispered, her voice like autumn leaves crumbling. "Keep it hidden. They took everything else, but they never found this." Lyra had never understood what she meant. The necklace looked like nothing special, silver gone black with age and a stone so clouded it might have been worthless glass. But she had kept it, worn it every day against her skin like a secret prayer. "Make way for Lady Seraphina." The command cut through her thoughts like a sword through silk. Lyra scrambled to press herself against the wall as the most beautiful woman in the kingdom swept into the hall, her golden hair catching the light like captured sunfire. Lady Seraphina moved with the fluid grace of someone who had never doubted her place in the world, her emerald silk gown whispering against marble floors that had been polished to mirror brightness. Behind her came a train of noble ladies, their laughter musical, and their jewels catching the light like stars fallen to earth. They were everything Lyra was not, beautiful, powerful, certain of their worth. Lady Seraphina's eyes swept over the preparations with the satisfaction of someone surveying her future domain. Everyone knew she would be chosen tomorrow night. The Alpha King needed a mate of suitable bloodline, and she was the most eligible wolf in 3 kingdoms. "The flowers should be moved closer to the dais," Lady Seraphina said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate obedience. "The Alpha King should see beauty when he arrives, not shadows." Her gaze fell on Lyra for a moment, cold and dismissive as winter frost. Lyra felt herself shrinking further into the stone, willing herself to become nothing, to disappear entirely. Lady Seraphina's lip curled in distaste before she turned away, already forgetting Lyra existed. The preparations continued around her like a dance she would never be invited to join. Servants hung garlands of moonflowers and silver ribbons, their efforts transforming the already magnificent hall into something that belonged in fairy tales. The ancient pack hierarchy was written in every detail, from the positioning of the chairs to the quality of the decorations. Alphas at the high table, betas in the places of honour, omegas scattered throughout the room like afterthoughts. And then there were the servants, the broken wolves, the ones who belonged nowhere at all. Lyra returned to her scrubbing, her brush finding the familiar rhythm that had sustained her through 18 years of invisible existence. She had learned early that survival meant becoming a shadow, something people looked through rather than at. The strategy had kept her alive, kept her fed, kept her from the darker fates that befell servants who drew unwanted attention. But tonight, something felt different. The necklace rested against her chest with an unfamiliar weight, warm despite the cool stone beneath her knees. She found her gaze drawn repeatedly to the ancient wolf statue that dominated the far end of the hall, its carved eyes seeming to follow her movements with unsettling intensity. The statue was older than the palace itself, carved from black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Legend said it had been created by the first wolves who settled in these mountains, blessed by magic so ancient that even the elders spoke of it in whispers. Most people avoided looking at it directly, claiming it made them uncomfortable. Lyra had always felt differently. When she looked at the statue, something deep in her chest stirred, a recognition she couldn't name. Tonight, that feeling was stronger than ever, as if the carved wolf was trying to tell her something urgent and important and dangerous. She pressed her palm against the necklace, feeling its steady warmth through her dress. Tomorrow, the most powerful unmated wolves in the kingdom would gather to find their destined partners. Tomorrow, Lady Seraphina would become queen. Tomorrow, the world would continue exactly as it always had, with Lyra invisible in her corner, scrubbing stones that would only get dirty again. But the necklace pulsed against her skin like a second heartbeat, and for the first time in her life, Lyra wondered if her grandmother's dying words had meant more than she understood. The carved wolf's eyes seemed to gleam in the flickering candlelight, ancient and knowing and patient as eternity itself. Something was coming, something that would change everything. She just didn't know it would change her first. 3 days after the battle, under the light of the crescent moon that had witnessed the rise and fall of a dozen royal bloodlines, Lyra Silvermoon was formally crowned Queen of the Silvermoon Territories. The ceremony took place in the same sacred grove where she had first been chosen by the Alpha King's wolf, but tonight the ancient stone circle blazed with silver fire that needed no torches or candles to illuminate the gathered crowd. The power that flowed through her veins had grown stable and sure, no longer the wild eruption that had marked her awakening, but something controlled and profound and absolutely regal. Elder Morna stood at the centre of the circle, her voice carrying the weight of centuries as she spoke the ritual words that had crowned queens for 1,000 years. By blood and bone, by power and right, by the ancient laws that govern wolf and moon, and the sacred bonds that tie soul to soul, I present Lyra Silvermoon, rightful heir to the Silvermoon throne, daughter of Queen Isadora, keeper of the ancient magics. The crown of stars manifested around her brow, without touch or ceremony, silver light solidifying into a circlet that blazed with inner fire visible to every witness in the grove. It was beautiful and terrible and utterly unmistakable, as anything but royal regalia, proof written in starlight that could not be disputed or denied. Around the circle, the assembled nobles and common folk alike dropped to one knee in the traditional acknowledgement of a true queen. Some knelt with genuine reverence, others with the grudging acceptance of political reality, but all recognised the authority that radiated from her like heat from a forge. "Rise, my people," Lyra said, her voice carrying easily across the grove with power that needed no amplification. Tonight we celebrate not just a coronation, but the end of deception that has shaped too many lives for too many years. She gestured, and silver light danced through the air to reveal images that told the story Elder Morna had carried in secret for nearly 2 decades. The murder of the royal family, the heroic sacrifice of Elena Brightwater, the careful conspiracy that had hidden the last heir and suppressed her power to keep her safe from enemies who would never stop hunting the Silvermoon bloodline. "Some of you served Lady Seraphina and her family's interests," Lyra continued, her silver eyes finding faces in the crowd that had once looked at her with contempt or dismissal. You were deceived, manipulated by those who put personal ambition above the welfare of our people. I hold no grudge against those who acted without knowledge of the truth. Murmurs of relief rippled through the assembly as former enemies found themselves offered mercy instead of retribution. It was a queen's first decree, and it spoke of wisdom that went beyond simple vengeance. But the ceremony was far from over. According to ancient tradition, a newly crowned queen required formal acknowledgement from her mate, the completion of bonds that would strengthen both rulers and secure the royal bloodline for generations to come. Kale stepped forward, magnificent in formal ceremonial garb that caught the silver light and threw it back in patterns of storm clouds and lightning. When he knelt before her, the gesture carried none of the political calculation that had marked their earlier interactions. This was genuine reverence, love made manifest in the most public way possible. "Lyra Silvermoon," he said, his voice rough with emotion that no ceremony could contain, "I claim you as my mate, my queen, my equal in all things. I offer you my strength, my loyalty, my kingdom, and my heart without reservation or condition." The mate bond, which had been pulling at them both for days with golden threads of connection, suddenly blazed to full completion. Power flowed between them like liquid light, Alpha King and Silver Moon Queen joining in a union that had been written in the stars long before either of them drew breath. Elder Morna raised her ceremonial staff, moonstone beads clicking softly as she spoke the final words of binding. "By the ancient prophecies, by the will of the sacred bonds, by the choosing of wolves and the blessing of moon and star, I declare these mates joined in truth and power. Let any who would challenge this union face the wrath of both bloodlines combined." Silver fire and storm lightning danced together around the joined couple, visible proof of a bond so powerful it made the very air sing with supernatural energy. The prophecies Elder Morna had kept hidden for decades blazed to life in the silver light, ancient words that spoke of a lost queen who would rise in the kingdom's darkest hour, of an Alpha King who would choose love over politics, of enemies defeated and a realm reborn in the fires of truth finally revealed. The crowd erupted in cheers that echoed off the mountain peaks, celebration that spoke of genuine joy rather than mere political obligation. They had witnessed something miraculous, the return of a bloodline thought extinct and the completion of a love story that had nearly torn their kingdom apart. But as the formal ceremonies concluded and the assembled nobles began to disperse, Lyra found herself drawn to the edge of the grove where shadows danced between ancient trees. The weight of the crown on her brow felt natural now, as if it had always belonged there, but the magnitude of what lay ahead seemed vast as the night sky. "Having second thoughts?" Kyle's voice was gentle as he joined her at the forest's edge, his presence warm and solid beside her. "Not about this," she said, gesturing to the crown that blazed with steady silver fire. "Not about us. But ruling is different from surviving, and I've spent most of my life focused on the latter." Kyle's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as the mate bond hummed with contentment between them. "You won't rule alone. That's what partnerships are for, what bonds like ours can accomplish when they're built on truth instead of political convenience." She leaned into his warmth, marvelling at how natural it felt to accept comfort instead of enduring hardship in isolation. The servant girl who had scrubbed floors and absorbed mockery seemed like a character from someone else's story, a disguise she had worn so long she had almost forgotten the woman beneath. "When I stopped believing I was worthless," she said quietly, silver light dancing around their joined hands, "I discovered I was capable of things I never imagined, but I never dreamed I was capable of this." She gestured to the grove where their people still celebrated, to the kingdom that stretched beyond the mountains, to the future that spread before them like an unwritten book waiting for their story. "You were always capable of this," Kyle replied, lifting their joined hands to press a kiss to her knuckles. The crown didn't make you a queen, Lyra. It just made your queenship visible to everyone else. The truth of that settled in her chest, like warmth on a winter night. She had been born royal, had carried the bloodline and the power and the responsibility in her very bones. The years of servitude hadn't diminished that. They had simply hidden it from a world that wasn't ready to see. But now the hiding was over. Now the pretending was done. Now she could be exactly what she had always been, beneath the carefully constructed disguise of worthlessness. The Silver Moon Queen stood with her mate at the edge of the sacred grove, silver light blazing around them, like a promise of the future they would build together. The kingdom had its rightful rulers, the ancient bloodlines were united, and love had triumphed over every obstacle that politics and fear could devise. And in the distance, carried on the night wind that whispered through the mountains, came the sound of wolves howling in harmony, their voices raised in celebration of the Queen who had finally come home. 3 months after the coronation, the Silver Moon Queen stood on her balcony overlooking a kingdom transformed by truth and guided by wisdom earned through suffering. The morning sunlight caught the crystal spires of the rebuilt watchtowers, their surfaces gleaming like captured starlight as they stretched toward a sky, unmarked by the smoke of war or the shadows of political deception. Below in the courtyard, children played games that had been forgotten during the years of careful tension, their laughter rising like music to remind everyone that hope was no longer a luxury the kingdom could not afford. Lyra touched the crown of stars where it rested against her brow, its silver fire now as familiar as her own heartbeat. The weight of it had become natural over the weeks of learning to rule, of discovering that the power flowing through her bloodline was meant not for destruction, but for service to those who depended on her strength. "The harvest reports from the eastern provinces," Kyle said, joining her on the balcony with the easy grace that marked all their interactions now. 3 months of partnership had taught them to move together, like dancers following music only they could hear, the mate bond weaving their thoughts and instincts into something greater than either could achieve alone. She accepted the scrolls he offered, her enhanced senses immediately picking up the satisfaction and relief that radiated from the parchment like perfume. "Record yields," she said, not needing to read the detailed numbers to understand their significance. "The healing I performed on the drought-damaged soil last month took hold." It was one of many small miracles that had marked her reign, the way her silver moon abilities served the kingdom in ways no political alliance could have managed. Crops that had been failing under the stress of poor weather recovered under the touch of royal magic. Wounded soldiers returned to health with speed that seemed impossible until witnesses understood they had been treated by a queen whose bloodline carried gifts that transcended ordinary healing. But perhaps most valuable of all was the way her ability to communicate with every wolf in the kingdom had transformed the very nature of governance. No longer did edicts flow down from distant authority figures who might or might not understand the needs of their people. Instead, Lyra felt the pulse of her kingdom like a second heartbeat, aware of problems before they became crises and able to offer solutions that came from genuine understanding rather than political expedience. "The delegation from the northern reaches arrived this morning," Kyle continued, settling beside her with the comfortable intimacy that had replaced their earlier careful distance. "They're requesting formal alliance, along with the mountain clans that used to raid our borders." Lyra smiled at the irony of it. The same kingdoms that had whispered about the impossibility of a servant girl becoming queen now competed for the privilege of formal alliance with the Silver Moon territories. Word of her abilities had spread beyond their borders, carried by merchants and travellers who spoke of a queen whose prophetic sight could prevent disasters and whose healing touch could restore what had been thought permanently broken. "What did you tell them?" "That alliance is earned through actions, not offered through words." Kyle's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as golden warmth flowed between them through the mate bond. "But I'm inclined to be generous, especially with the northern reaches. Their delegation included a formal apology for supporting Seraphina's family, and an offer to hunt down the remaining conspirators who fled after the battle. The mention of their former enemies brought only mild satisfaction rather than the burning anger Lyra might have expected. 3 months of ruling had taught her that vengeance was a luxury that queens could rarely afford, and that justice served the kingdom better than retribution served personal feelings. Let them prove their commitment through deed rather than promise, she decided. Alliance can wait until they've demonstrated that their loyalty extends beyond political convenience. Below them, the palace staff moved through their daily routines with efficiency that spoke of genuine dedication rather than fearful obligation. Lyra could still remember the cruel laughter of servants who had mocked the cursed girl with the grey wolf, but those same people now served her with respect that had been earned through her treatment of them after her identity was revealed. She had offered positions of greater responsibility to those who showed talent, had established programs to ensure no servant's child would grow up without education, had made it clear that worth in her kingdom would be measured by contribution rather than bloodline. The transformation had been remarkable, turning a court that thrived on petty cruelties and careful hierarchy into something that actually functioned for the benefit of everyone within its walls. "Do you ever miss it?" Kyle asked quietly, following her gaze to the courtyard where she had once scrubbed stones and endured mockery. The simplicity of invisibility. Lyra considered the question seriously, as she considered all questions that touched on the magnitude of her transformation. "I miss not knowing how much pain exists in the world," she said finally. "When I can feel the struggles of every wolf in the kingdom through my connection to them, when prophetic sight shows me problems that are still months away from manifesting, ignorance seems like it would be a peaceful gift." She paused, silver light dancing around their joined hands as the mate bond pulsed with shared understanding. "But I wouldn't trade the ability to help for the comfort of not knowing help was needed. That would be the worst kind of selfishness." "Spoken like a true queen," Kale said, pride warming his voice in ways that had nothing to do with political advantage and everything to do with love that had deepened into something unshakable. In the distance, a group of pilgrims emerged from the sacred forest where Lyra had first manifested her full power. The clearing where she had defeated Lady Seraphina's assassins had become a site of pilgrimage for those seeking healing or wisdom, and every day brought new visitors who left offerings of gratitude for a queen who used her gifts in service of others. "The girl who thought she was nothing became everything the kingdom needed," Lyra murmured, watching the pilgrims make their way toward the palace, where they would be welcomed regardless of their ability to pay for royal audience. "You were always everything the kingdom needed," Kale corrected gently. "You just needed the right circumstances to let everyone else see it." The mate bond hummed with contentment between them, golden threads of connection that had grown stronger with every day of shared responsibility and mutual respect. They ruled as true partners, each bringing unique strengths to challenges that required both storm and silver, both the Alpha King's decisive authority and the Silver Moon Queen's intuitive wisdom. The kingdom prospered under their joint rule in ways that went beyond simple measurements of wealth or military strength. It prospered in the laughter of children who no longer feared the arbitrary cruelty of those in power, in the confidence of citizens who knew their queen could literally feel their needs, in the security that came from rulers whose bond was strong enough to weather any storm that might threaten their people. As the sun reached its zenith and painted the kingdom in shades of gold that matched the warmth flowing between them, Lyra allowed herself a moment of profound satisfaction. She had travelled an impossible distance from invisible servant to beloved queen, but the journey had taught her that true worth had never been about the destination. It had always been about the courage to keep walking toward the light, even when the darkness seemed absolute. Dawn broke over the Silver Moon Kingdom like a promise kept, painting the sky in shades of rose gold that matched the warmth flowing between the royal couple who stood together on their private balcony. Lyra rested against the stone railing, her hand curved protectively over the small swell of her abdomen that had only begun to show in recent weeks. The crown of stars had long since integrated with the ancient necklace, creating a circlet that blazed with silver fire while maintaining the delicate chain that connected her to her grandmother's final gift. Heritage reclaimed, power embraced, legacy secured for the generations yet to come. "Do you remember," she said softly, watching the sunrise paint their kingdom in liquid gold, "when I used to believe I was cursed, when I thought the gods had marked me for suffering and solitude?" Kale's arms circled her from behind, his hands coming to rest over hers on the gentle curve where their child grew. The mate bond hummed with contentment so profound it made the very air around them shimmer with golden light. "I remember when you thought you were nothing," he replied, his voice rough with emotion that 3 months of happiness had only deepened. "I remember how wrong we all were about what nothing could become." She leaned back against his chest, marvelling at how completely her understanding of the world had transformed. The servant girl, who had scrubbed floors and endured mockery, seemed like a character from someone else's story, a disguise so complete she had almost forgotten the woman underneath. But that girl's suffering hadn't been meaningless. It had taught her compassion for the invisible, empathy for the forgotten, wisdom about the difference between worth assigned by others and worth that existed independent of external validation. "The kingdom started healing the moment you stopped pretending to be powerless," Kyle continued, his hands warm and steady over their joined future. "Not because of the magic in your bloodline, though that helps, because you finally let yourself care openly about things that mattered, the crops, the children, the wolves who had no voice in the politics that shaped their lives." Below them, the kingdom stirred to life with the easy rhythm of a people who no longer feared the arbitrary cruelty of those in power. Merchants opened their stalls without worrying about taxes that might bankrupt them on a noble's whim. Children ran through streets that had been cleaned of both physical filth and the uglier stains of systemic injustice. Guards walked their routes knowing they served justice rather than the convenience of whoever held temporary authority. "She's going to be powerful," Lyra murmured, her enhanced senses already picking up the supernatural potential that pulsed through their unborn daughter like a second heartbeat. "Silver Moon bloodline mixed with Alpha King heritage. The prophetic dreams I've been having show her surrounded by light that makes my abilities look like candle flames." "She's going to be loved," Kale corrected gently. "Power is a tool, Lyra. Love is what makes it worthwhile." The truth of that settled in her chest like warmth on a winter morning. She had spent so many years believing that love was something she didn't deserve, something that existed for other people, but could never extend to the grey wolf with the tarnished necklace who scrubbed floors in the shadows. Learning to accept love, from him, from her people, from herself, had been harder than mastering any supernatural ability. But it had also been the key to everything else. The power that flowed through her bloodline was devastating when used in anger or fear, but when it was channeled through love, through genuine care for others' well-being, it became something that could reshape kingdoms and heal wounds that went deeper than flesh. "I love you," she said, the words carrying the weight of everything she had learned about herself, about worth, about the difference between being chosen by others and choosing to accept what had always been true. "I love you for seeing me when I was invisible, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself, for choosing our bond even when it meant rewriting the politics of kingdoms." "I love you," Kale replied, his voice soft with wonder that had never faded despite months of happiness, "for having the courage to become who you truly are, for refusing to let them convince you that suffering was your natural state, for showing me that the strongest thing any of us can do is admit we were wrong about what we deserved." The sunrise reached its peak, flooding their kingdom with light that caught the silver fire of her crown and threw it back in patterns that painted their subjects' faces with hope made visible. In the distance, she could see pilgrims making their way toward the sacred forest where her transformation had begun, carrying offerings and prayers to the Queen, who had proven that even the most broken-seeming things could harbour light sufficient to illuminate entire worlds. The mate bond blazed between them like captured starfire, stronger now than it had been even during the desperate early days when they fought against political impossibility. 3 months of partnership, of shared responsibility and mutual respect, had woven their connection into something that transcended the supernatural and entered the realm of the miraculous. Their daughter stirred beneath Lyra's hands, responding to the warmth and security that surrounded her even in the womb. She would be born into a kingdom where worth was measured by contribution rather than bloodline, where power existed to serve rather than dominate, where love was considered a strength rather than a weakness to be exploited. The girl who thought she was nothing became everything the kingdom needed, Lyra whispered, watching silver light spread across the land like blessing made manifest. The girl who thought she was cursed discovered she was the answer to prayers that hadn't even been spoken yet, Cale added, pressing a kiss to the crown that blazed with inherited power and chosen wisdom. As the sun climbed higher and the kingdom below them stirred to life, silver fire danced around them, both like celebration, like promise, like the visible proof that sometimes the most profound transformations happen not when we become someone new, but when we finally have the courage to become who we always were beneath the lies that others taught us to tell ourselves. The Silver Moon Queen stood with her mate and their unborn child, watching light spread across a kingdom that prospered under rulers who had learned that true strength comes not from the power to take whatever you want, but from the wisdom to give whatever love requires. And in that light, carried on morning winds that whispered through mountain peaks and sacred groves, the very air seemed to sing with stories yet to be told, with destinies yet to unfold, with the eternal truth that even in the darkest of circumstances, even when hope seems impossible, love has a way of finding the light. The earth trembled first. Lyra felt it through the soles of her worn boots, a vibration that started deep in the mountain's bones and worked its way up through stone and mortar until even the crystal chandeliers sang with it. The servants around her went still, their gossip dying mid-sentence as something primal in their wolves recognized what approached. Power, raw, undiluted and absolute. The Alpha King had arrived. The great doors of the ceremonial hall burst open as if pushed by hurricane winds, and Cale Blackthorn stepped into the space like a force of nature given flesh. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator who had never known fear, never questioned his right to dominate everything around him. The air itself seemed to bend around his presence, thick with the kind of authority that made lesser wolves bare their throats without thought. Lyra pressed herself deeper into the alcove where she had been arranging flowers, her hands trembling as she fought the inexplicable urge to drop to her knees. Her wolf, usually quiet as a whisper, suddenly surged against her ribs with desperate, confusing need. The sensation was so violent it stole her breath, left her gasping behind a pillar of carved moonstone as her body betrayed everything she thought she knew about herself. Alpha King Cale was beautiful in the way that avalanches were beautiful, devastating and inevitable and impossible to look away from. His dark hair caught the light like raven's wings, and when he turned his head, she glimpsed eyes the colour of storm clouds, silver grey and crackling with barely leashed lightning. He wore his power like other men wore clothing, comfortable and natural and utterly without apology. The entire hall held its breath. Nobles who had been laughing moments before now stood frozen, their wolves instinctively recognising a predator so far above them in the hierarchy that resistance was not just futile, but unthinkable. Even Lady Seraphina, radiant in her certainty, took an involuntary step backward before catching herself, but then she lifted her chin, smoothed her golden hair, and glided forward with practised grace. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice pitched to carry the perfect note of reverence wrapped around confident expectation. "The Moonspire Pack welcomes you." Kyle's gaze swept over her like winter wind, assessing and calculating. "Lady Seraphina." His voice was exactly what Lyra had expected it to be, dark velvet threaded with steel. "You look well." It was not quite a compliment, not quite dismissal, but something carefully neutral that revealed nothing of his intentions. Lady Seraphina's smile never wavered, though Lyra caught the faint tightening around her eyes that spoke of frustration carefully hidden. "The ceremony preparations are complete," Lady Seraphina continued, moving closer with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything she wanted. "The sacred grove awaits tomorrow's moon." But Kyle was no longer looking at her. His storm cloud eyes had begun to move through the assembled crowd with predatory focus, searching for something, or someone. The intensity of his gaze made the air shimmer like heat haze, and everywhere it touched, wolves dropped their eyes in instinctive submission. Lyra shrank further into her alcove, willing herself invisible with the desperation of prey hiding from a hunter. But the necklace at her throat was growing warm, then hot, then burning like a brand against her skin. She pressed her palm against it through her rough dress, trying to muffle whatever strange reaction was building inside the ancient silver. The warmth spread from the pendant through her entire body, a golden heat that made her wolf lift its head for the first time in years. The sensation was intoxicating and terrifying, like standing too close to a bonfire, knowing it could consume her, but unable to step away. And then Cale's eyes passed over her hiding place. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, their gazes met across the vast ceremonial hall. Silver crashed into brown like lightning striking earth, and Lyra felt something fundamental shift in the architecture of her world. Recognition blazed between them, instant and impossible and utterly devastating. The necklace flared with heat so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Her wolf surged upward with a keening cry that she barely managed to trap behind her teeth. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to go to him, to cross that impossible distance and claim what was calling to her across the charged air between them. But that was insane. She was nothing. He was everything. The thought of approaching the Alpha King was so absurd it bordered on madness. Kyle's nostrils flared slightly, his head tilting as if catching a scent that intrigued him. His eyes narrowed, focusing on her alcove with laser intensity that made her feel pinned like a butterfly to a board. For a terrifying moment, she thought he might come to her, might cross the hall in front of everyone and demand answers to questions she didn't understand. "Your Majesty," Lady Seraphina's voice cut through the moment like a blade through silk. "Shall I show you to your chambers? The ceremonial fast begins at sunset." The spell broke. Kyle's attention shifted back to Lady Seraphina, though something in his posture remained coiled and alert. "Of course," he said, but his voice had gone rough around the edges, distracted. As he followed Lady Seraphina from the hall, surrounded by the subtle choreography of nobles vying for his attention, Lyra sagged against the stone pillar like a marionette with cut strings. Her entire body shook with reaction, with the aftershocks of whatever had just passed between them. The necklace was still warm against her skin, pulsing with a rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. She touched it again, wondering frantically what was happening to her, why her grandmother's worthless trinket was reacting to the Alpha King's presence like some kind of supernatural beacon. Around her, the hall slowly came back to life as servants resumed their preparations and nobles returned to their political manoeuvring. But the air still hummed with residual power, thick with the scent of pine forests and winter storms that clung to the Alpha King like a second skin. Lyra tried to return to arranging flowers, but her hands wouldn't stop trembling. Every breath brought his scent deeper into her lungs, and every heartbeat sent fresh waves of impossible longing through her veins. Her wolf paced restlessly beneath her skin, whining for something she couldn't name and didn't dare acknowledge. The ancient wolf statue at the far end of the hall seemed to watch her with new intensity, its carved features almost animated in the flickering torchlight. For a wild moment she could have sworn she saw approval in those stone eyes, as if the statue understood something about what had just happened that she did not. The ceremonial preparations continued around her, but Lyra felt as if she were moving through a dream. Tomorrow night the Alpha King would choose his mate from among the eligible wolves of the realm. Lady Seraphina would stand in the sacred grove with her golden hair and perfect bloodline, and she would become queen, as everyone expected. But the necklace burned against Lyra's chest like a secret, and the memory of silver eyes meeting hers across an impossible distance made her wolf howl silently with longing that had no name and no hope and no future. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. And the most terrifying part was that it felt completely, devastatingly right. The sacred grove breathed with ancient power. Moonlight filtered through the canopy of silver-leafed trees, casting everything in ethereal luminescence that made the assembled wolves look like creatures from legend. The ceremonial circle had been carved from living stone 3 centuries ago, its intricate patterns flowing outward from the centre like ripples in a supernatural pond. Tonight, those carvings pulsed with soft light, responding to the full moon's call with magic older than memory. Lyra stood at the very back of the crowd, pressed against the rough bark of an ancient oak, where shadows could swallow her whole. She had no business being here. Servants didn't attend mating ceremonies unless they were serving wine or clearing away the remnants of celebration. But something had drawn her from her quarters, some compulsion she couldn't resist or understand. The necklace lay heavy against her chest, its warmth having steadily increased throughout the day until it felt like molten silver against her skin. She kept one hand pressed over it, terrified someone might notice the strange heat radiating through her plain brown dress. Elder Thorne stepped into the centre of the circle, his voice carrying the weight of centuries as he began the ancient invocation. Under the light of the harvest moon, we call upon the bonds that tie soul to soul, heart to heart, destiny to destiny. His words seemed to sink into the very ground, awakening forces that made the air itself shimmer with possibility. The eligible wolves formed 2 loose groups on either side of the circle. The females stood like flowers in a garden of silken jewels, their beauty enhanced by moonlight and expectation. At their centre, Lady Seraphina glowed like a golden beacon, her confidence absolute and radiant. The males arranged themselves with subtle displays of dominance and submission, but all eyes were on the Alpha King. Kyle stood apart from the others, his dark form imposing even in the supernatural light. Power rolled off him in waves that made lesser wolves unconsciously step back, creating a circle of deference around him that spoke of his absolute authority. "Let the sacred bonds reveal themselves," Elder Thorne intoned, raising his staff toward the moon. "Let the ancient magic choose as it has chosen since the first wolves walked these mountains." The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Lyra felt her heart hammering against her ribs as the ceremonial magic began to build, thick and electric in the air around them. The assembled crowd held their breath, waiting for the inevitable moment when the Alpha King would choose Lady Seraphina and the political alliance would be sealed. But Kyle's face was stone, his silver eyes distant and troubled as if he were fighting some internal battle. His hands were clenched at his sides, knuckles white with tension that spoke of barely contained struggle. Lady Seraphina stepped forward with practised grace, her chin lifted in regal expectation. "I offer myself to the sacred bonds," she declared, her voice carrying clearly across the grove. "I offer my bloodline, my power, my devotion to the future of our people." The words were traditional, expected, perfect in their formality. Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd as nobles nodded at the appropriateness of the match. Lady Seraphina's family beamed with pride and anticipated triumph. But Cale didn't move. He stood frozen at the edge of the circle, his breathing shallow and rapid as if he were drowning in the thick magical air. Something was wrong. His wolf was fighting him, pushing against his human will with desperate, inexplicable need. "Your Majesty?" Elder Thorne's voice carried a note of concern as the silence stretched beyond comfortable bounds. And then Cale's control shattered like glass against stone. The transformation hit him like lightning, violent and unstoppable and absolutely magnificent. His clothes dissolved into shadow as his body expanded and reformed, bones cracking and muscles flowing like liquid power. In seconds, the man disappeared entirely, replaced by the largest wolf Lyra had ever seen. The Alpha King's wolf was midnight given form, black as starless sky, with eyes like molten silver. He stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, his presence so overwhelming that several lesser wolves dropped to their bellies in instinctive submission. Power radiated from him in waves that made the ceremonial stones sing and the ancient trees bend their branches in reverence. But instead of approaching Lady Seraphina, instead of sealing the political alliance everyone expected, the magnificent black wolf turned his head and looked directly at Lyra. Time stopped. The world narrowed to that single moment of connection, silver eyes meeting brown across an impossible distance. And then he moved, flowing through the crowd like liquid shadow, his massive form parting the assembled wolves as easily as wind parts wheat, straight toward her. Gasps erupted from the crowd as the Alpha King's wolf bypassed every eligible female in the grove, ignoring Lady Seraphina's shocked stillness and the desperate confusion of the nobles. He moved with singular purpose, his eyes never leaving Lyra's face as she pressed herself against the oak tree in absolute terror. "No," she whispered, the word barely a breath. "No, this isn't possible." But the great black wolf reached her anyway, stopping mere inches away as his massive head lowered to her level. His scent enveloped her completely, pine forests and winter storms and something indefinably male that made her knees buckle. Her own wolf, dormant and grey and pathetic, suddenly surged upward with a cry that came from the depths of her soul. Mine. The word echoed in her mind, and she didn't know if it came from her wolf or his, or the ancient magic that pulsed through the grove like a heartbeat. All she knew was that when the Alpha King's wolf pressed his muzzle against her trembling hands, the necklace at her throat exploded with light. Silver fire blazed through the thin fabric of her dress, visible to every shocked witness in the grove. The ancient pendant, hidden for so long beneath rough cloth and careful secrecy, suddenly blazed like a star fallen to earth. The light was pure and cold and utterly beautiful, turning her brown hair to burnished gold and her plain face luminous with power she had never known she possessed. The crowd's shock turned to chaos. Voices rose in disbelief, in anger, in confusion so complete it bordered on panic. "Impossible!" someone shouted. "She's nothing. She's nobody." But the light from her necklace painted everything in silver radiance, and the Alpha King's wolf remained at her side like a mountain that could not be moved. Cale's human consciousness fought desperately against his wolf's certainty, but the mate bond was settling into place like a key turning in a lock. Every instinct he possessed, every fibre of his supernatural being, recognised this trembling servant girl as his destined partner. The political implications were devastating, the personal implications were overwhelming, but the bond was absolute. Lady Seraphina's golden beauty had turned pale as moonlight, her perfect composure cracking as she witnessed her future crumbling around her. "This is wrong," she declared, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "She's a servant. She has no bloodline, no power, no worth." The last word dripped with venom that made several wolves wince, but the Alpha King's wolf only pressed closer to Lyra. his massive form shielding her from the crowd's incredulous stares. The silver light from her necklace continued to pulse, growing stronger rather than fading, as if responding to his presence with joy that could not be contained or denied. Elder Thorne stepped forward, his ancient eyes wide with wonder as he studied the blazing pendant. "The crown of stars," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crowd's confusion. "I haven't seen its light in 20 years. The word sent a chill through Lyra that had nothing to do with the cool night air. Crown of stars. The name meant nothing to her, but it clearly meant everything to the elder, whose face had gone pale as parchment. But before anyone could ask what he meant, before the implications could fully sink in, the ceremony dissolved into complete chaos. Nobles shouted over each other, demanding explanations that no one could provide. Lady Seraphina's supporters clustered around her like armour, their faces dark with political calculation and growing fury. And in the centre of it all, the Alpha King's wolf remained pressed against Lyra's side, his presence the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. The impossible had happened. The servant girl had been chosen by destiny itself. Everything else was just politics and pride, and the bitter taste of expectations shattered like glass against the immutable will of the sacred bonds. The necklace pulsed with silver fire, and Lyra finally understood her grandmother's dying words. They took everything else, but they never found this. The days that followed were a blur of whispered conversations and averted eyes. Lyra had been moved from the servants' dormitory to a small chamber in the tower, supposedly for her protection, but in reality to hide the embarrassment she had become. The room was comfortable enough, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the courtyard, but the guard stationed outside her door made it clear she was as much prisoner as protected guest. The necklace had returned to its usual tarnished silver, the blazing light of that impossible night seeming like a fever dream, but it remained warm against her skin, pulsing with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat whenever her thoughts turned to silver eyes and the scent of winter storms, which was far too often for her peace of mind. She pressed her palm against the pendant through her dress, trying to understand what had happened in the sacred grove. The Alpha King's wolf had chosen her. The most powerful male in the kingdom had claimed her as his destined mate in front of hundreds of witnesses. It was impossible, unprecedented, and politically catastrophic, and somewhere deep in her chest, beneath layers of fear and confusion, her wolf sang with joy that she didn't dare acknowledge. "You should never have been there." The voice cut through her thoughts like ice through flesh. Kyle stood in her doorway, having dismissed the guard with a gesture. In the 3 days since the ceremony, this was the first time he had come to see her, and the sight of him made her breath catch in her throat. He looked exhausted, lines of strain etched around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. His dark hair was dishevelled as if he'd been running his hands through it, and his usually perfect composure had cracked enough to show the turmoil beneath. "Your Majesty," Lyra whispered, scrambling to her feet and dropping into an awkward curtsy. "I'm sorry. I know I shouldn't have been at the ceremony. I don't know why I went. I just—" "Don't." The word came out harsher than he'd intended, and she flinched as if struck. Kyle closed his eyes, fighting for control, as the mate bond pulled at him like golden threads wrapped around his ribs. Being this close to her was agony and ecstasy in equal measure, every instinct he possessed demanding he cross the small room and claim what his wolf insisted was his. But he couldn't. The kingdom hung in the balance. "This bond," he said finally, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "It cannot be honoured. You must understand that. Lady Seraphina's family controls the eastern passes, and without their alliance we face war with the mountain clans. Thousands will die if I choose personal desire over duty to my people." Lyra felt something vital crumble inside her chest, though she had known this moment would come. Of course he couldn't choose her. She was nothing, nobody, a servant who had somehow caught the attention of forces beyond her understanding. "I understand," she whispered, though the words tasted like ashes. "Do you?" Kyle's silver eyes met hers across the small room, and she saw the same desperate longing that clawed at her own heart. "Because I can feel you right now, Lyra. Your emotions, your pain, the way your wolf calls to mine. The bond is there whether we acknowledge it or not, and it's tearing me apart." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither dared cross. Lyra wrapped her arms around herself, trying to contain the golden threads of connection that seemed to stretch toward him with every breath. "What happens to me now?" Kyle's jaw clenched with the effort of maintaining distance when every fibre of his being wanted to close the space between them. "You'll be kept safe, hidden. The official story is that the ceremony was disrupted by ancient magic that sometimes creates false bonds. In time, people will forget." But they both knew that was a lie. Neither of them would forget, and the bond would continue to strengthen whether they fed it or not. Already, Lyra could sense his emotional state like a second heartbeat, could feel the way his wolf paced restlessly beneath his skin. "Lady Seraphina visited me yesterday," Lyra said quietly, and Kyle's entire body went rigid. "What did she say?" "That accidents happen to girls who don't know their place." Lyra's voice was steady, despite the fear that had kept her awake since the encounter. She was very polite about it, but the message was clear. Kyle's hands clenched into fists, power crackling around him like barely contained lightning. "She threatened you." "She doesn't need to make threats explicit. Everyone knows what happens to inconveniences in noble families." Lyra touched the necklace through her dress, drawing comfort from its warmth. "I won't be a problem for you, Your Majesty. I know what I am." But even as she spoke the words of submission, something rebellious stirred in her chest. The necklace pulsed with sudden heat, and for a moment she could have sworn she heard her grandmother's voice whispering in the wind that rattled her window. "You are more than they know, more than they fear, more than they can imagine." "You don't know what you are," said a new voice from the doorway. Both Cale and Lyra turned to see an ancient woman entering the room, her silver hair braided with moonstone beads that clinked softly as she moved. Elder Morna was old enough to remember the kingdom's founding, her eyes sharp as winter stars despite her age. "Elder," Kyle said carefully, inclining his head in respect, "this is not the time for—" "This is exactly the time," Morna interrupted, her attention fixed entirely on Lyra. "Show me the necklace, child." Lyra's hand flew protectively to her throat. "I don't understand." "The crown of stars," Morna continued, stepping closer with the intensity of a hunting hawk. "I saw it blaze in the sacred grove, saw the light that hasn't shone in 20 years. Show me." With trembling fingers, Lyra pulled the pendant from beneath her dress. In the afternoon light streaming through her window, it looked ordinary again, tarnished silver holding a clouded stone. But Morna's intake of breath was sharp enough to cut glass. "Blessed moon and stars," the elder whispered, reaching out one gnarled finger to trace the air above the pendant without quite touching it. "It's real. After all this time, it's real." "What's real?" Kyle demanded, moving closer despite his earlier resolve to maintain distance. "What is that thing?" Morna's eyes glittered with knowledge and secrets accumulated over decades. "Not a thing, Your Majesty. A key, a crown, a birthright that was hidden so well, even the child who carries it doesn't know what she possesses." The necklace grew warm against Lyra's chest, responding to the elder's words with building energy that made the air around them shimmer. "My grandmother left it to me," she whispered. "She said to keep it safe, to keep it hidden." "Your grandmother," Morna repeated, and something in her tone made both younger wolves go still. "What was her name, child?" "Elena Brightwater." The name fell into the sudden silence like a stone into deep water. Morna closed her eyes, her face going pale as parchment. "Elena, dear gods, I thought she was dead. I thought you were all dead." She opened her eyes again, and they blazed with recognition and dawning understanding. You're not a servant, child. You're not nobody. You're the lost heir of the Silver Moon bloodline." The words hit Lyra like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making the room spin around her. "That's impossible. The Silver Moon line died out 20 years ago. Everyone knows that." "Everyone knows what they were told," Morna corrected, her voice gentle but implacable. "The royal family was murdered, yes, but one child escaped, a baby girl, hidden and protected by a loyal servant named Elena, who gave up her own identity to save her charge." The necklace blazed with sudden light, silver fire that filled the small room with radiance that made them all squint. Lyra gasped as power rushed through her veins, ancient and royal and absolutely undeniable. Her wolf, grey and weak and pathetic, suddenly lifted its head with dignity that had been sleeping for 18 years. "No," she breathed, but the light continued to grow, and somewhere deep in her bones she felt the truth settling like a key finding its lock. "It's not possible. I'm nobody. I'm nothing." "You are the rightful queen of the Silver Moon territories," Morna said simply, "and your mate is the Alpha King. The sacred bonds chose correctly, child. They always do." Kyle stared at Lyra, as if seeing her for the first time, understanding finally dawning in his storm-grey eyes. The impossible servant girl who had disrupted his entire world wasn't impossible at all. She was exactly what she was meant to be, his equal, his queen, his destiny. And Lady Seraphina's threat had just become infinitely more dangerous. That night, alone in the darkness of her tower room, Lyra learned the truth about everything she had believed about herself. Elder Morna had returned after the evening meal, carrying a leather satchel that clinked with the sound of ancient implements. The old woman moved with purpose that spoke of rituals performed in secret for decades, her moonstone beads catching the candlelight as she arranged her tools on the small wooden table. "What you experienced today was only the beginning," Morna said, her voice low and careful. "The crown of stars recognizes its rightful bearer, but your power has been deliberately suppressed since infancy. We must undo those bindings if you're to survive what's coming." Lyra sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the necklace warm against her chest and her hands trembling with a combination of fear and anticipation. "I don't understand any of this. How can I be royal? My grandmother was a servant. I'm a servant. I've scrubbed floors my entire life." "Your grandmother was many things," Morna replied, spreading a circle of salt mixed with crushed moonstone around the table. Elena Brightwater was lady-in-waiting to Queen Isadora of the Silver Moon line, and when the royal family was betrayed and murdered, she saved the only thing that mattered. She saved you. The old woman's eyes grew distant as she lit candles infused with herbs that filled the room with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and ancient magic. "I was there the night you were born, child, 18 years and 3 months ago, in the midst of a blizzard that seemed sent by the gods themselves to hide your arrival. Your mother, Queen Isadora, was the most powerful wolf I'd ever known until that moment. The Silver Moon bloodline carries gifts that other royal lines can only dream of." Lyra's breath caught as the candles flared higher, their flames dancing without wind. "What kind of gifts?" "Command over all wolves, regardless of pack affiliation. Healing that can bring someone back from the very edge of death. Prophetic sight that can see the threads of fate before they're woven. And most rare of all, the ability to bond with the ancient spirits that guard our territories." Morna's gnarled hands moved through the candlelight, weaving patterns that made the air shimmer. "Your mother could call down the very stars to fight at her side." The necklace blazed with sudden heat, and Lyra gasped as power rushed through her veins like liquid lightning. For a moment she could see the room through different eyes, could sense the life force of every creature in the palace, could feel the ancient magic that flowed through the mountain's bones like underground rivers. "The power recognizes you," Morna whispered, her voice thick with wonder. "Even after 18 years of suppression, it remembers its rightful home." "How?" Lyra's voice came out strained as she fought to contain the energy building inside her chest. How was it suppressed? Morna pulled a small silver knife from her satchel, its blade etched with symbols so old their meaning had been lost to all but a few. Blood magic. Elena bound your power into your very bones when you were 6 months old, weaving spells that would keep you hidden from those who hunted the silver moon line. But such bindings aren't permanent. They weaken over time, especially when exposed to strong emotional catalyst. Like the mate bond, Lyra breathed, understanding finally beginning to dawn. Like the mate bond, Morna confirmed. Your connection to the Alpha King has been unravelling the suppression spells for days now. That's why the necklace has been growing warmer, why you've been sensing things you shouldn't be able to sense. The crown of stars is calling its power home. The old woman held out the silver knife, its blade glinting in the candlelight. But to fully break the bindings, we need blood freely given and ritually spilled. Are you ready to discover who you truly are, Lyra Silvermoon? The name hit her like a physical blow. Silvermoon, not the nameless servant girl, not the nobody who scrubbed floors and tried to remain invisible. Lyra Silvermoon, daughter of Queen Isadora, heir to the most powerful bloodline in 3 kingdoms. Her wolf stirred restlessly beneath her skin, no longer grey and weak, but silver and strong and ancient beyond measure. The creature that had always felt wrong in her body suddenly felt like coming home. "Yes," she whispered, extending her hand toward the blade. The cut was shallow but precise, 3 drops of royal blood falling onto the salt circle with soft sounds, like tears hitting stone. The moment her blood touched the enchanted salt, the world exploded into silver fire. Power erupted from the necklace in waves that shook the very foundations of the tower. Lyra screamed as 18 years of suppressed magic crashed back into her body all at once, her bones cracking and reforming as her wolf finally claimed its true shape. Silver light poured from her skin, so bright it turned night into day, visible even through the stone walls of her prison. In the king's chambers, 3 floors below, Kyle jerked upright from uneasy sleep as the mate bond flared like molten gold in his chest. Something was happening to Lyra, something powerful and dangerous and absolutely magnificent. He could feel her power awakening through their connection, feel the ancient magic that had been sleeping in her blood finally breaking free. He was moving before conscious thought kicked in, racing through corridors in nothing but sleep pants, following the golden thread that connected his soul to hers. Behind him, he could hear guards shouting in confusion as silver light blazed from the tower windows like a beacon visible for miles. But he wasn't the only one who had noticed. Lady Seraphina stood at her own window, watching the impossible light that poured from the servants' tower with growing horror and understanding. She had suspected something after Elder Morna's visit, had paid servants to whisper reports of the old woman's strange activities. But this was proof of her worst fears. The nobody, the servant girl who had disrupted her perfect future, wasn't nobody at all. She was powerful, dangerously, catastrophically powerful. And if her bloodline was what Seraphina suspected it might be, then everything, the kingdom, the alliances, the careful balance of power, was about to change forever. "Send word to my father," she told her lady-in-waiting, her voice cold as winter steel. "Tell him the situation has evolved beyond political manoeuvring. Tell him we need the hunters." In the tower room, Lyra's transformation was reaching its peak. The power that had been caged for 18 years roared through her system like a wildfire, burning away everything weak and false and imposed from outside. Her wolf finally stood at full height, silver as moonlight and proud as any creature born to rule. "Now you understand," Elder Morna whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Now you know what they feared, what they hunted, what they tried so hard to destroy. You are your mother's daughter, child. You are the Silver Moon heir, and heaven help us all, because they're going to try to kill you for it." The necklace had transformed completely. No longer a simple pendant, but a circlet of starlight that hovered just above her brow, marking her as undeniably, irrefutably royal. Power hummed in her veins like music, and when she looked in the small mirror on her washstand, silver eyes looked back, eyes that held the wisdom of ages and the strength of mountains. She was no longer the invisible servant girl who scrubbed floors and endured mockery. She was Lyra Silvermoon, rightful queen of the Silvermoon territories, possessor of power that could reshape kingdoms. And judging by the sounds of armoured feet racing up the tower stairs, she was about to need every bit of that power to survive what came next. The door burst open just as Cale reached it, his silver eyes wild with concern and something that might have been awe. Behind him crowded guards and nobles drawn by the impossible light, their faces slack with shock as they stared at the transformed woman who had been a servant mere hours before. "Everyone out," Kyle commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of an alpha who would not be questioned. Now. But as the room emptied and he stepped toward her, Lyra could feel new eyes watching from the shadows. Enemies who had spent 20 years believing the Silver Moon line was extinct, who would do anything to keep it that way. Everything she thought she knew about herself was a lie, and the truth was going to get her killed. Morning arrived with cruel efficiency, bringing with it the bitter taste of political necessity and the sharp edge of mortal danger. Lady Seraphina stood in her father's private study, sunlight streaming through diamond-paned windows to illuminate maps and correspondence that spoke of alliances spanning 3 kingdoms. Lord Aldrich Ravencrest had built his power through careful calculation and ruthless precision, and his daughter had inherited both traits in full measure. "The situation has become untenable," she said, her voice cool as winter frost, despite the fury burning in her emerald eyes. "The servant girl isn't just an embarrassment anymore. She's a threat to everything we've built." Her father didn't look up from the letter he was writing, his elegant script flowing across parchment that bore the seal of the mountain clans. "Explain." "She's Silvermoon bloodline, I'm certain of it. The power display last night, the way the ancient crown responded to her. She's the lost heir that everyone assumed was dead." Seraphina's hands clenched at her sides, perfect composure cracking to reveal the desperation beneath. "If she's recognised officially, if the Alpha King honours the mate bond, our alliance becomes worthless. The eastern passes, the trade routes, everything we've negotiated dissolves into nothing." Lord Aldrich finally looked up, his pale eyes sharp as winter ice. "You're certain of her bloodline?" "Certain enough, and even if I'm wrong, she's still a complication that threatens our position. The king is already showing signs of choosing her over political wisdom." Seraphina moved to the window, gazing out at the courtyard where servants scurried about their morning duties. "We need to act before this goes any further. What do you propose?" The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Seraphina's reflection in the glass looked pale and determined, beauty hardened by necessity into something sharp enough to cut. An accident, something that removes the problem without implicating us directly. I have contacts among the kitchen staff, people who understand that loyalty to the right cause brings rewards. Her father nodded slowly, already calculating angles and alibis. Make it look natural, a weak constitution finally succumbing to the stress of sudden elevation. These common-born girls often can't handle the pressure of noble attention. But as they spoke, weaving plans that would end a life to preserve their political future, the object of their plotting sat in her tower room struggling with forces that defied their careful calculations. Lyra stared at her reflection in the small mirror, hardly recognising the face that looked back. Her eyes held flecks of silver now, remnants of the power that had blazed through her the night before. The crown of stars circlet had faded back to its pendant form, but it pulsed with visible light that made hiding it impossible. Even beneath layers of clothing, the glow seeped through fabric like moonlight through clouds. Her hands trembled as she tried to eat the breakfast that had been brought to her, simple porridge and bread that should have been comforting, but tasted wrong somehow. The silver in her eyes flared, and suddenly she could smell something bitter beneath the wholesome scents, something that made her wolf recoil in instinctive alarm. Poison. The knowledge hit her like a physical blow, certain and terrifying. Someone had tried to kill her with her morning meal, and only her awakening power had saved her from swallowing death disguised as kindness. The door opened without warning, and Kyle entered with the controlled urgency that spoke of barely leashed violence. He took one look at the untouched food, at her pale face and silver-touched eyes, and his expression went dangerously still. "You sensed it," he said, and it wasn't a question. "The porridge, something's wrong with it." Lyra pushed the bowl away from her, her stomach churning with more than just fear. "Someone tried to poison me." Kyle's controls snapped like a bowstring under too much tension. Power exploded around him, making the air itself crackle with barely contained fury. "Guards!" His voice carried the absolute authority of an alpha who would not be denied. "I want this food tested. I want every servant who touched it questioned. And I want Lady Seraphina and her father in my chambers within the hour." But even as he gave orders, even as the castle erupted into controlled chaos around the investigation, Lyra felt the truth settling in her bones like winter cold. This was only the beginning. The poison breakfast was a test, a probing strike to see if her awakening power would protect her. When it failed, they would try again with methods less subtle and more certain. "I can't stay here," she said quietly, the words falling into the sudden silence after the guards departed. "As long as I'm here, I'm a target, and as long as I'm a target, you have to choose between protecting me and protecting your kingdom." Kyle turned to her with eyes like storm clouds, silver grey and crackling with emotion he could no longer contain. "You think I care about the politics anymore? You think I can weigh the value of trade routes against the feeling of you dying through our bond?" He crossed the small room in 2 strides, stopping just close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "The mate bond is destroying my ability to think clearly, Lyra. Every rational thought I have gets burned away the moment I consider losing you." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither had dared cross before. Lyra felt her own careful barriers crumbling, the walls she had built to protect herself from hoping for impossible things finally giving way under the weight of his admission. "Then what do we do?" she whispered. "Because they won't stop. Whatever I am, whatever bloodline I carry, it threatens something they're willing to kill for." Before Kale could answer, the necklace flared with sudden heat against her chest. Silver light poured through her dress as her power surged in response to emotional turmoil, and with it came a flash of prophetic sight that stole her breath. She saw herself running through dark corridors while assassins gave chase, saw silver fire exploding from her hands as enemies closed in from all sides, saw Kale fighting desperately to reach her while political allies became enemies, and enemies revealed themselves as something far more dangerous than simple rivals. And through it all, she saw Lady Seraphina's face, beautiful and cold, and absolutely determined to see her dead. The vision faded, leaving her gasping and shaking in the sudden silence. Kyle's hands found her shoulders, steadying her as the prophetic power receded like tide from shore. "What did you see?" he asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "War," Lyra breathed, the word tasting like ashes on her tongue. "Not just assassination attempts or political manoeuvring. Actual war, with blood and death and everything you've been trying to prevent." She looked up at him with silver-touched eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. "They're not going to stop with poison in my breakfast, Kyle. They're going to keep escalating until one of us is dead." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed up the tower stairs, multiple sets moving with the measured pace of people preparing for a confrontation they expected to win. Elder Morna's voice drifted through the door, tight with worry and warning. "Your Majesty, Lord Ravencrest and Lady Seraphina are here as you requested, but they've brought armed guards, and I don't think they're here to discuss terms." Kyle's expression went deadly calm, the kind of stillness that preceded storms capable of levelling mountains. Then we stop talking and start acting. He turned to Lyra, silver eyes blazing with decision that would reshape kingdoms. You're right, you can't stay here, but you're not running alone. The necklace pulsed with warm light, and Lyra felt her power stirring in response to his conviction. For the first time since learning her true identity, she felt something other than fear and confusion. She felt ready to fight. The hunt had begun. But the hunters were about to discover that their prey had claws of her own, and a mate who would burn down kingdoms rather than let her face the darkness alone. Everything changed when she stopped running and started hunting back. The sacred forest bordered the eastern edge of the palace grounds, its ancient trees standing sentinel over secrets that predated kingdoms and bloodlines alike. Lyra walked among the silver-leafed oaks with desperate need for solitude, the crown of stars pulsing beneath her cloak like a heartbeat visible to any who might look too closely. The political confrontation in the tower had ended with threats barely veiled as diplomacy, Lord Ravencrest's cold voice promising consequences if the unfortunate situation wasn't resolved quickly and quietly. She needed air, she needed space, she needed somewhere to think beyond the suffocating walls of political necessity and impossible choices. But solitude was a luxury she no longer possessed. The attack came without warning, figures in dark cloaks materializing from the shadows between trees like nightmares given flesh. Professional assassins moved with practiced silence, their blades glinting in the filtered sunlight as they closed in from all sides. Lyra's newly awakened power screamed danger before her conscious mind registered the threat. Silver fire erupted from her hands without thought or control, blazing through the forest with heat that turned leaves to ash and made the very air shimmer with deadly radiance. The first assassin's scream was cut short as silver flames engulfed him completely. The second managed half a step before the fire found him, consuming flesh and bone with hunger that spoke of ancient magic unleashed after too many years of suppression. The third tried to flee, but the power that roared through Lyra's veins demanded completion, demanded that every threat be eliminated with prejudice absolute and terrible. When the flames finally died, she stood alone among the charred remains of those who had come to kill her, silver light still dancing around her fingertips like captured starfire. The forest was silent except for the soft fall of ash that had once been leaves, once been men who thought they could murder a queen and walk away unmarked. She stared at her hands in horror and wonder, at the power that had erupted from her without conscious command. This was what she was, not the invisible servant girl who scrubbed floors, but something ancient and dangerous and absolutely lethal when cornered. Lyra. Kyle's voice cut through the supernatural silence, rough with shock and something that might have been awe. She turned to find him at the edge of the clearing, silver eyes wide as he took in the scene of destruction that surrounded her. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "They came out of nowhere, and the power just—" "You defended yourself," Kyle said, stepping carefully through the ash that had been her enemies. "You did what any queen would do when assassins come for her life." Queen. The word hit her like lightning, blazing with truth she could no longer deny. She was a queen, whether she claimed the title or not. The power burning in her veins was royal power, ancient and terrible and absolutely her birthright. And the man walking toward her through the remains of her enemies was her mate, her equal, the other half of a bond that grew stronger with every breath, despite all their attempts to deny it. "This can't continue," she said, though her voice broke on the words. "Every day I stay, the danger grows. Every day I remain here, you have to choose between me and your kingdom." She gestured to the ash-covered clearing, to the evidence of what she had become. "Look what I am, Kyle. Look what happens to people who threaten me. Is this the queen you want beside you? Is this the future you can offer your people? Kyle reached her then, his hands finding her face despite the silver fire that still flickered around her fingers. You think I care what you are? You think any of that matters when I can feel your heart breaking through our bond? His voice was rough with emotion held too long in check. I love you, Lyra. I love your strength, your compassion, your absolute refusal to let them break you. I love you enough to burn down kingdoms if that's what it takes to keep you safe. The confession shattered the last of her defences, the walls she had built to protect herself from impossible hope, crumbling under the weight of his words. I love you too, she breathed, the admission torn from the depths of her soul. I love you so much it's destroying me. Every moment we're apart feels like dying. Every breath I take without you tastes like ash. They came together then, like forces of nature colliding, silver fire and storm winds meeting in desperate embrace that spoke of love too powerful for politics to contain. The mate bond blazed between them, golden light that turned the ash-covered clearing into something sacred and profound. But even as they held each other, even as the bond sang with completion, the sound of approaching hoofbeats reminded them that love was not enough to stop the world from its cruel turning. Lady Seraphina rode into the clearing at the head of a company of armed nobles, her golden hair gleaming in the sunlight and her emerald eyes hard as winter glass. She took in the scene with calculating precision, the dead assassins, the silver fire still dancing around Lyra's form, the way the Alpha King held his supposedly impossible mate as if she were the only solid thing in a world gone mad. How convenient, Seraphina said, her voice carrying easily across the scorched earth. The problem reveals its true nature in such a public way. She gestured to the ash that had once been men. Witnesses will testify that the servant girl murdered loyal subjects of the crown. Self-defence, you might claim, but murder nonetheless. They were assassins, Kyle snarled, power crackling around him like barely leashed lightning. Hired killers sent to do what? Seraphina interrupted, her smile sharp as a blade. Defend themselves against a creature of uncontrolled power? Look around you, your majesty. Look at what she has done, what she is capable of. Is this the mate you want? Is this the monster you would choose over the alliance that keeps our borders secure? The word monster hit Lyra like a physical blow, and she felt Cale's rage spike through their bond as her pain became his own. But Seraphina wasn't finished, her voice rising with the authority of someone delivering an ultimatum. My father's message is simple. Renounce this creature publicly, honour the alliance you swore to uphold, and we can pretend this unfortunate episode never happened. Continue to choose personal desire over duty to your people, and the Eastern passes close tomorrow. The mountain clans will have free rein to raid our territories, and every death will be laid at your feet. The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword suspended over all their futures. Lyra felt the mate bond straining under the weight of impossible choice, golden threads stretched thin between love and duty, between what they wanted and what their peoples needed. I won't let you destroy him, she said quietly, her voice carrying despite its softness. I won't let my existence tear apart everything he's built. She stepped back from Cale's embrace, silver fire dying to embers around her fingertips. I'll leave, tonight. I'll disappear, and you can tell whatever story makes the politics work. No. The word tore from Kyle's throat like a physical wound. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for political convenience. I won't choose duty over the bond that makes me whole. But even as he spoke, Lyra could feel the decision settling in her bones like winter cold. The mate bond was becoming unbearable, physical pain that tore at both of them when they were apart, and political disaster when they were together. Someone had to make the choice that neither of them could make. Someone had to be strong enough to walk away. When I stopped believing I was worthless, she whispered, silver tears tracking down her cheeks, I learned that sometimes love means letting go. She looked at him one last time, memorizing silver eyes and storm-touched features that would haunt her dreams. Find a way to be happy, Kyle. Find a way to be the king your people need. She was turning to leave, power already gathering around her for the transportation magic that would take her far from everything she loved, when the earth began to shake. Not the small tremor that announced the Alpha King's presence, but the deep, rolling earthquake that spoke of armies on the march and forces that cared nothing for politics or ultimatums or the careful balance of power. From the eastern horizon came the sound of war horns, deep and resonant, and absolutely terrifying in their promise of violence to come. The mountain clans were moving, their alliance with Lord Ravencrest revealed as the trap it had always been. Lady Seraphina's face went pale as her carefully laid plans crumbled around her. The assassination attempts, the political pressure, the ultimatums, all of it had been designed to force this moment, to create chaos that outside enemies could exploit. "You played right into their hands," Elder Morna's voice cut through the confusion as the old woman appeared at the edge of the clearing, her face grim with knowledge too long delayed. "The mountain clans never wanted alliance, they wanted division. They wanted the royal bloodlines fighting each other while they prepared to take everything." The necklace blazed with sudden heat against Lyra's chest, and with it came prophetic sight that showed her the truth in blazing clarity. The political manoeuvring, the careful pressure to separate her from Kyle, all of it had been orchestrated by enemies who understood that divided they could be conquered, but united they were absolutely unstoppable. "They're not just coming for the kingdom," she breathed, understanding finally dawning. "They're coming for me. The Silver Moon bloodline is the key to something, and they can't risk letting it awaken fully." The war horn sounded again, closer now, and Lyra felt the last pieces of her suppressed power roaring to life in response to the threat. The crown of stars circlet materialized around her brow, blazing with light that could be seen for miles. The choice had been taken from them. There would be no quiet disappearance, no political manoeuvring, no careful balance between love and duty. There would only be war. And in war, queens didn't run. They fought. The world narrowed to that single moment when everything she had ever believed about duty and sacrifice shattered against the immutable will of love. Lyra stood at the forest's edge, power gathered around her like a cloak of starlight, ready to transport herself far from the kingdom that could never be her home. The war horns echoed through the mountains, growing closer with each breath, and she knew that walking away now meant leaving Kyle to face the storm alone. She had taken exactly 3 steps toward exile when the first enemy wolf broke through the tree line. The mountain clan warriors moved like shadows given flesh, their forms larger and more savage than any wolves she had seen. They poured through the forest in a flood of snapping jaws and gleaming fangs, their howls rising in harmonies that spoke of blood hunger and territorial conquest. And they were heading straight for the palace, straight for Kyle. The choice crystallized in her mind with perfect, devastating clarity. She could run, could use her awakening power to escape to the far reaches of the kingdom and let others pay the price for her existence, or she could finally stop running from what she was and fight for the only thing that had ever mattered. Love won. Love always won. The crown of stars blazed against her chest like a captured sun, responding to her decision with power that made the very air around her sing. But this time, instead of trying to contain the force building inside her, instead of fighting the transformation that clawed at her bones, Lyra opened herself completely to what she was meant to become. The change hit her like lightning striking from within, violent and beautiful and absolutely inevitable. Silver light erupted from her skin in waves that turned the darkening forest bright as noon, power so intense it made the ancient trees themselves bow in reverence. Pain lanced through every bone as they cracked and reformed, as her spine elongated and her senses exploded into supernatural awareness. She could hear every heartbeat in the palace, could smell the fear and desperation of her people as death approached on 4 legs. She could feel Kyle's horror through their bond as he realized the scope of the threat bearing down on them. But mostly, she could feel the ancient magic of her bloodline finally claiming its rightful home. Her wolf manifested with a howl that shook the mountains, silver as moonlight and proud as any creature born to rule. This wasn't the weak, grey shadow that had cowered in her chest for 18 years. This was a queen's wolf, ancient and powerful and absolutely magnificent in its fury. The crown of stars necklace dissolved into pure light around her brow, reforming as an actual circlet of silver fire that marked her as undeniably, irrefutably royal. Ancient markings blazed to life across her skin, symbols of power that had been dormant in her blood since birth, waiting for this moment of complete acceptance. She was no longer Lyra the servant girl. She was no longer the lost heir hiding from her destiny. She was Lyra Silvermoon, rightful queen of the Silver Moon territories, and she was done pretending to be anything less. The transformation completed just as the first wave of enemy wolves reached the palace grounds. Through her heightened senses, she could perceive the entire battle unfolding like pieces on a chessboard. Kyle fighting desperately in the main courtyard, outnumbered but refusing to fall. Palace guards struggling against enemies that moved with supernatural coordination. Lady Seraphina and her supporters trapped in the Great Hall, their political manoeuvring suddenly meaningless in the face of real violence. And above it all, the truth that blazed in her prophetic sight like revelation written in starfire. The mountain clans weren't here for territory or resources. They were here for her, the last of the Silver Moon bloodline, the key to ancient magics they wanted to claim or destroy. Well, they could try. Power flowed through her like molten silver, and with it came abilities that had been sleeping in her blood for nearly 2 decades. Command over all wolves, regardless of pack allegiance. Healing touch that could bring someone back from death's very threshold. Prophetic sight that let her see the threads of fate before they were woven. And most dangerous of all, the ability to call upon the ancient spirits that guarded the mountain territories. Forces of nature that had protected the royal bloodlines since the first wolves walked these lands. She raised her head and howled, a sound that carried the authority of queens and the fury of storms. Every wolf within 10 miles felt it, a call that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the supernatural core that defined their species. The effect was immediate and devastating. Enemy wolves stumbled mid-charge as her royal command crashed over them, their assault faltering as instincts older than civilization demanded submission to the true alpha among them. Even the mountain clan leaders, powerful in their own right, found themselves fighting the overwhelming urge to bare their throats to the Silver Queen, whose authority resonated in their very bones. But Lyra wasn't content with stopping their attack. She was done being reactive, done letting others dictate the terms of her existence. If they wanted the Silver Moon heir, they could face her at full power and discover exactly what they had awakened. She moved through the battle like vengeance given form, silver fire trailing from her fingertips as she cut through enemy ranks with surgical precision. Where her power touched wounded allies, flesh knitted back together and strength returned. Where it found enemies, it burned with cold flame that left no mercy for those who threatened her people. Her people. The realization hit her with stunning force as she fought. These weren't just Kyle's subjects, weren't just the citizens of a kingdom she happened to be hiding in. They were hers to protect, hers to rule, hers to love and defend and die for if necessary. She reached the main courtyard just as Kyle was being forced back by 3 massive enemy wolves working in coordinated attack. Blood streaked his human form, testament to the battle he'd been fighting, but his silver eyes blazed with determination that refused to bend even in the face of overwhelming odds. The sight of him injured, of her mate fighting for his life while she had been preparing to abandon him, sent rage through her that made the silver fire around her hands flare white-hot. "Get away from him," she commanded, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a queen who would not be disobeyed. The enemy wolves turned toward her, and she saw the moment recognition hit them, saw the instant they understood exactly what they were facing, and knew with grim satisfaction that they finally grasped the magnitude of their mistake. They hadn't come to hunt a powerless servant girl hiding from her destiny. They had come to challenge a queen in her own territory, and she was about to remind them why the Silver Moon bloodline had been both feared and revered for 1,000 years. Silver fire blazed around her like wings of liquid starlight, and when she smiled, it held all the terrible beauty of winter storms and falling stars. The true queen had awakened, and she was magnificent. The battle raged around them like a symphony of violence and supernatural fire, but in the space between heartbeats, everything else faded away except the Silver Queen, who blazed like a fallen star in the centre of the courtyard. Kyle stared at Lyra, at the magnificent creature she had become, and felt the last of his careful control crumble into ash. This wasn't the frightened servant girl who had hidden in alcoves and scrubbed floors. This was a queen in her full power, terrible and beautiful, and absolutely his in ways that went deeper than flesh or politics or the careful calculations of kingdoms. The 3 enemy wolves that had been pressing their attack suddenly found themselves facing something far more dangerous than an outnumbered alpha king. Silver fire erupted around Lyra's transformed form, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of mountains and the fury of winter storms. "You came to my kingdom, you threatened my people, you dared to raise claws against my mate." Each word blazed with power that made the very stones beneath their feet tremble. "Now face the consequences." What followed wasn't a battle. It was a demonstration. Lyra moved through the enemy ranks like vengeance personified, her silver wolf form flowing between human and supernatural with deadly grace. Where her claws struck, silver fire followed, burning through fur and flesh with cold flame that left no room for mercy. Her royal command crashed over the mountain clan warriors in waves, forcing submission from wolves who had never bowed to any authority. But it was more than raw power that devastated their assault. It was the ancient fighting instincts that blazed to life in her blood, combat techniques passed down through 1,000 years of Silver Moon queens. She fought like poetry written in violence, each movement precise and devastating, and absolutely beautiful in its lethal efficiency. The enemy force that had seemed so overwhelming moments before began to crumble under her assault. Lesser wolves submitted outright, their instincts recognizing a superior alpha and refusing to fight any longer. The stronger ones tried to maintain their attack, but found themselves outmatched by power that had been sleeping for 20 years and now roared to life with accumulated fury. In less than 10 minutes it was over. The courtyard fell silent except for the soft crackling of silver flames and the laboured breathing of those who had survived the Queen's wrath. Bodies lay scattered across the stones, testament to what happened when anyone threatened the Silver Moon bloodline in its own territory. But even as the immediate threat ended, Lyra's prophetic sight blazed with understanding that made her silver eyes blaze with cold fire. The attack had been coordinated from within, planned by enemies who understood the palace's defences and the timing of its vulnerabilities. "Seraphina," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence, "your family orchestrated this." The golden-haired noblewoman stood in the entrance to the great hall, her perfect composure finally cracking as she found herself facing not a powerless servant, but a queen whose authority was written in silver fire and ancient bloodlines. Around her clustered the surviving members of her faction, their faces pale with the understanding that their careful political manoeuvring had just become treason. "Prove it," Seraphina said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. Lyra smiled, and it held all the terrible beauty of justice finally delivered. "Gladly." She raised her hand, and silver light poured from her fingers to reveal the truth written in the very stones of the courtyard. Images blazed in the air above them, prophetic sight made manifest for all to witness, messages between Lord Ravencrest and the Mountain Clan leaders, gold-changing hands, maps of the palace defences, plans to eliminate both the troublesome servant girl and the Alpha King who chose her over political necessity. The evidence hung in the air like judgment written in starfire, undeniable and absolutely damning. Gasps rose from the assembled nobles as they witnessed the scope of the betrayal, the way their supposed allies had planned to use political division to destroy them all. "You would have let them slaughter everyone," Kyle said, his voice rough with barely contained rage as he stepped to Lyra's side. "Your own people, your own kingdom, just to eliminate a threat to your position." "I did what was necessary," Seraphina snarled, her mask finally slipping to reveal the desperation beneath. "She's an abomination, a creature of uncontrolled power that threatens the natural order. Better the kingdom fall than be ruled by something that shouldn't exist." The insult blazed through the courtyard like a challenge issued and accepted. By ancient law, by traditions that predated kingdoms and bloodlines, such words could only be answered one way. "Trial by combat," Elder Morna's voice carried from the crowd, the old woman's eyes bright with knowledge of laws written in blood and honour. "She has challenged the Queen's right to exist. Let the ancient ways decide." Lyra felt the rightness of it settle in her bones like coming home. No more politics, no more careful manoeuvring around the sensibilities of those who would never accept her. Just the pure test of strength against strength, power against power, the truth revealed through combat as it had been for 1,000 years. "I accept," she said simply. The transformation back to her wolf form was smoother this time, power flowing through her like water finding its proper channel. Her silver wolf stood proud in the centre of the courtyard, ancient authority radiating from every line of her supernatural form. Lady Seraphina's shift was beautiful in its own right, golden fur catching the last light of evening as she took her wolf shape. She was strong, well-trained, politically connected to powerful bloodlines. Under any other circumstances, she would have been a formidable opponent. But she wasn't facing any other opponent. She was facing the Silver Moon Queen, and the outcome was never really in doubt. The fight was brutal and swift. Seraphina fought with skill and desperation, her golden wolf form darting and striking with techniques learned from the finest tutors. But Lyra fought with power that had been awakening for days and instincts that reached back through centuries of royal bloodline. Silver fire blazed around her claws as she met every attack with devastating counterstrikes. When Seraphina tried to use speed, Lyra moved like liquid lightning. When she attempted to overpower through brute force, ancient strength flowed through royal muscles that had never known their true potential. The end came when Seraphina overextended in a desperate lunge for Lyra's throat. Silver jaws closed around golden fur with precision that spoke of absolute dominance, and suddenly the would-be queen found herself pinned beneath claws that could have ended her life with a single flex. But instead of delivering the killing blow, Lyra stepped back and resumed her human form, silver light still dancing around her fingertips as she looked down at her defeated rival. "You live," she said simply, "but not here. Take your family and your treacherous allies and leave this kingdom tonight. If any of you are found within our borders after dawn, the exile becomes permanent in ways that transcend geography." Seraphina shifted back to human form, her perfect beauty marred by cuts and the bitter taste of absolute defeat. "This isn't over," she whispered. "There are others who will never accept you, never bow to a creature. Queen." Kyle's voice cut through her threats like a blade through silk. He stepped forward, his silver eyes blazing with decision that would reshape kingdoms. "She is my queen, my mate, my equal in all things, and anyone who challenges that challenges me." He moved to Lyra's side, taking her hand as silver fire still danced around her fingers. I renounce the political alliance with House Ravencrest. I claim Lyra Silvermoon as my destined mate and rightful queen. Let any who dispute this face the consequences. The declaration rang across the courtyard with the weight of prophecy fulfilled. Around them, the surviving nobles began to kneel, some out of genuine respect, others out of political necessity, but all acknowledging the new reality that had been written in silver fire and royal blood. The servant girl was gone forever. In her place stood a queen who had earned her crown through battle, through sacrifice, through the kind of love that was strong enough to reshape the world. And when Kyle kissed her there in the courtyard where she had proven her worth, silver light blazed around them both like blessing given form, like destiny finally claiming its own. The kingdom had its true rulers at last.